The advertisement had used 9 words. That was the first thing Lorelei Marsh noticed about it, sitting in the back of the general store in Guelph, with someone else's newspaper folded in her lap, and a cup of tea she couldn't finish going cold beside her. Most men who placed notices in the Gazette used more words than that. They described acreage and prospects and Christian character and the possibility of a comfortable life. Douglas Scoffield had used 9 words: rancher, widower, 3 daughters, northern Alberta, need-capable woman, not fragile. No punctuation after fragile. No apology for the bluntness. Not even a period, as though the sentence had simply stopped because he had decided he was done. Lorelei had read it 4 times. Then she had folded the paper, set it on the counter, walked back to the room she shared with her younger cousin above the laundry, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time watching the wall. She was 28 years old. Her husband had been dead for 16 months. The position at the milliner's had ended in March, when Mrs. Hennessy's nephew arrived from Toronto needing employment, and the quiet arithmetic of that situation had required no explanation. The room above the laundry cost $4 a month. She had $11 left, and a trunk that held everything she owned, which was not very much and weighed less than she expected for a life. She wrote back the next morning, not because the advertisement moved her, not because she had ever harbored a particular feeling about Alberta, which was as far from anything she knew as a place could reasonably be while still being Canada. She wrote back because staying meant slowly running out of something, and she had learned in the 16 months since Owen died that running out of things, even small things, has a cumulative weight that eventually becomes its own kind of grief. Leaving at least meant something different was coming. The stagecoach left her at the edge of a settlement called Dunmore Crossing on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, when the sky had the flat, gray determination of a place that has already decided what winter will be and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The town, if it warranted the name, was a thin collection of buildings that looked like they had arrived separately and not been formally introduced. A hardware store. A post office that shared its front wall with something that might have been a telegraph office. 2 churches on opposite sides of the main road, which told her something about the local disagreements. A feed supplier with a handwritten sign in the window that had been there long enough to fade. And beyond all of it, stretching in every direction under the enormous sky, the open land of the Peace River country, enormous and pale and entirely indifferent to her arrival. Perhaps a dozen people were visible on the road. Every single one of them looked at her. She had been looked at before. She understood the particular grammar of a small town examining a stranger. But Dunmore Crossing looked at her the way you look at a weather pattern you're not sure about, with the specific combination of assessment and reserved judgment that would take time to move past. A woman in a gray coat stepped out of the post office and studied her the way a farmer studies a horse before making an offer. "You'll be the one Scoffield sent for," the woman said. It was not a question. Lorelei Marsh. She kept her voice level. She had gotten good at level. Harriet Goss. "I run the post office." The woman's eyes moved over her in a brief professional sweep. "He should have sent someone to meet you. I assumed he would. Knowing Scoffield, he assumed you'd manage." A pause. "Can you?" "I've managed further than this," Lorelei said. Harriet Goss looked at her shoes, then at her face, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth. The suggestion that warmth was possible at some future point under the right conditions. "I'll have my husband drive you out," she said. "The Scoffield place is 4 miles east. You'll want to arrive before dark." The Scoffield ranch appeared over a low rise as the light was going. Lorelei's first honest thought was one she kept entirely to herself, because there was no one to tell it to, and no particular use in saying it aloud. It looked tired, not ruined. The bones of the place were good. The main house was solid timber with a deep porch and a chimney that was working, a thin ribbon of smoke rising in the cold air. The barn was large. There was a proper well and what had once been a kitchen garden, now mostly gone to seed. But the whole property had the particular look of something that had been holding on through sustained effort, and was not entirely certain how much longer effort would be sufficient. A section of fencing leaned at an angle nobody had corrected. The porch steps had a split board on the left side that had been there long enough to gray. The yard was clean, which told her someone was still managing, but the managing had the quality of triage rather than care. Harriet's husband let her off at the gate and turned back toward town before she had her bag fully in hand. She stood at the gate. Then the front door opened and 3 girls came out. They did not come out the way children come out when something new arrives, tumbling over each other, curious and loud. They came out quietly, oldest to youngest, and stood on the porch steps with the particular stillness of children who have learned to wait and see before they decide what a new thing means. The oldest was perhaps 12, with dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes that were already doing the kind of watching that takes years to develop. The middle one was maybe 9, with her arms crossed and a look around her mouth that was not quite hostile, but was clearly not ready to be friendly. The youngest was 5 or 6, with a smear of something on her cheek, and one boot not quite laced, and she was gripping the back of her middle sister's coat with both hands. None of them said anything. Lorelei picked up her bag and walked to the porch steps. "I'm Lorelei Marsh," she said. "I'm looking for Mr. Scoffield. He's in the barn." The oldest one. Her voice was careful and entirely flat. "He said to wait, all right." Lorelei set her bag down and sat on the top porch step since no one offered the chairs. "What's your name?" The oldest blinked, as though the question surprised her. "Nesta? And your sisters?" A nod toward the middle one, and Cora, the youngest, who was looking at Lorelei with the frank, unguarded stare of a child who hasn't yet learned to manage what shows on her face. "All right," Lorelei said again. She looked out at the yard and the land beyond it and the big, cold sky. She did not fidget. After a moment, Cora climbed up the steps and stood 2 feet away from her and stared at her hair. "It's red," Cora announced. "It is. Our mama had brown hair. Did she? Papa still has her hairbrush in his room." A pause. "He doesn't use it. He just has it." She said this the way children say true things, without understanding that the saying of it might land differently than intended. "She died when I was 3. I don't remember what she smelled like. Bridget says she smelled like cedar soap, but I don't know if that's real or if Bridget made it up." Lorelei was quiet for a moment. There was nothing useful to say that wouldn't be wrong in one direction or the other. "That's a hard thing," she said finally, not being sure. Cora seemed to consider this. "Are you going to be our new mama?" "I'm going to marry your father." "Whether I become your mama is something we'd have to figure out together. It doesn't happen just because someone says so." Cora turned this over. "Nesta says you won't stay, does she? She says the last lady who came looked at the house and went back to Edmonton the same day." A pause. "She didn't even come inside." "I've come inside," Lorelei said. "Or near enough." Cora looked at her bag on the porch, then looked at Lorelei, then sat down on the step beside her and pulled her unlaced boot up onto her knee and began struggling with it. Lorelei reached over without comment and tied it for her. Cora accepted this without remark, which was in its way an answer. Douglas Scoffield came out of the barn 35 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him. Steady boots on packed ground. The particular sound of a man who moves through physical work, the way other people move through conversation, without thinking much about it. He came around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw her on the steps. Something crossed his face for just a moment, too fast to name. Then it was gone. He was not what she had pictured. She wasn't sure what she had pictured. He was broad through the shoulders, not especially tall, with dark hair that had started going gray at the temples and a beard that was a few days past tended. His hands, when she noticed them, were the hands of someone who has done serious work for 20 years and has the particular kind of stillness that comes from not wasting movement. He walked to the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. "Miss Marsh?" "Mr. Scoffield." He looked at Cora, then at her bag, then briefly at her face, with the systematic efficiency of a man cataloging a situation. "Supper's whatever the girls put together," he said. "I wasn't certain of your arrival time. That's fine. Room's off the kitchen. Small, I don't need much space." A pause. He seemed to be completing some internal calculation. "Wedding's Friday. Reverend Tate comes through every 3 weeks. We caught him at the right time. Friday is fine." He nodded as though they had agreed on something logistical and unremarkable like the placement of a fence post. Then he turned back toward the barn. "Mr. Scoffield," she said. He stopped. "It's good to meet you," she said. She meant it simply, the way you mean things when you have made a decision and intend to stand behind it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, likewise, with the particular flatness of someone who has not said that particular word in some time and is uncertain whether he still means it, but is making the effort. Then he went back to the barn. Lorelei sat back against the porch post. Cora had fallen asleep against her arm, which had happened so gradually she hadn't noticed until it was finished. The land stretched out beyond the fence, enormous and darkening, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up into the cold, still air, and she thought, well, here we are. The wedding was on a Friday morning that was cold and gray, and determined about it. Reverend Tate was a lean, weathered man with kind eyes, who performed the ceremony in the Scoffield front room with the 3 girls in a row along the wall. Nesta with her arms folded, Bridget looking at the window, Cora watching everything with complete attention. Harriet Goss had come, self-invited, and apparently comfortable with that. 2 neighboring families stood near the back wall, with the carefully neutral expressions of people who are reserving judgment, but don't want to appear unkind. Douglas stood beside her in a clean shirt and his good jacket, which he had pressed himself. She could see the uneven crease, and held himself with the controlled quietness of a man, enduring something he has decided is necessary. Lorelei wore her blue wool dress. She'd repaired the cuffs by lamplight the night before, sitting in the small room off the kitchen listening to the house. The creak of the girls moving, the wind finding the gaps in the eaves, the particular sound of a house that had been getting by on its own for too long. Reverend Tate said the words. She said her part. Douglas said his in a voice that was level and without inflection. When it was done, Harriet made a small sound of satisfaction. The girls didn't clap. Cora reached over and took Lorelei's hand and held it briefly and then let go. It was the most deliberate thing any of them did. There was no cake. There was coffee and a tin of shortbread that Lorelei had made at 5 that morning, because she'd been awake and the kitchen had been there, and it had seemed more useful than lying in the dark. Afterward, Douglas stood in the kitchen doorway while she washed up the cups. "You didn't have to make anything," he said. "I was awake." He leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment with that contained, observing quality he seemed to carry everywhere, like a man who has learned that looking carefully costs less than speaking carelessly. "You can call me Douglas," he said. "All right, Douglas." She set down a cup. "I want to say something plainly, if that's acceptable." "Go ahead. I know what this is. I know what it isn't. I'm not expecting it to be more than it is, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at him. "But I think we'll both do better if we're honest with each other. I intend to do right by your family. That's what I can promise, and I think it's worth something." He was quiet for a long moment. His expression was the same careful, unreadable thing it had been since she'd arrived, and she was beginning to understand it wasn't a mask so much as a habit so deep it had become structural. "It's worth something," he said finally. Then he went outside, and she heard his boots on the porch steps, and then nothing but the wind and the sound of the house settling around her. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment and felt the weight of what she had walked in to press in from all sides. Not despair, not joy either. Something more honest than either of those. Something that lives in the territory between them, which is where most real things actually happen. She picked up the next cup and finished washing it. By the end of the first week, she understood the scale of the problem. She had expected difficulty. The advertisement had said capable woman, not fragile, and she'd read that clearly. But there is a difference between expecting difficulty and standing inside it, and the Scoffield household delivered that difference with quiet efficiency. The pantry was the first problem. It revealed itself the way problems do, gradually and then all at once. By the third day, she understood that what looked like adequate stores was actually the result of someone. Nesta, she would learn, carefully arranging things to appear more plentiful than they were. The flour would last 3 weeks if she was careful. The salt pork was running low. The root cellar had potatoes but not enough, and several had started to go soft. She said nothing to Douglas about this, not yet. She spent the 4th evening making a written inventory at the kitchen table while the house slept, using a pencil stub and the back pages of a small notebook she'd brought from Guelph. Then she sat with the inventory and looked at it and thought. The ranch itself was another matter. She could see from the evidence around her that it had once functioned properly. The barn was solidly built. The pasture fencing had been well maintained at some point. But there were cattle missing from what the barn's capacity suggested should be there, and the equipment showed the particular kind of neglect that comes not from laziness, but from one person trying to manage what had been built for 2. Douglas rose at 4:30. He was in the barn by 5. He came in for breakfast, ate with the focused efficiency of a man completing a required task, and went back out. He returned at midday for whatever was available, and again at dark she had not seen him stop. The girls ran on a version of the same rhythm, scaled to their ages. Nesta managed the chickens and the kitchen garden remnants with the competence of someone who has been doing adult work since she was 10. Bridget did what she was told and said very little. Cora followed Lorelei everywhere and reported on things she observed. A mouse she'd seen near the barn. The sound the second stair made that was different from the other stairs. A crack in the kitchen plaster she'd been watching for 3 weeks to see if it got longer. What Lorelei noticed underneath all of it was what was missing, the living kind of noise. Not working noise, there was plenty of that. But the other kind, the kind that belongs to people who are actually present with each other rather than simply occupying the same building. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued in the ordinary way of people who are comfortable with each other. The girls spoke to their father in brief functional exchanges, and he answered the same way. Nobody spoke to Lorelei at all, beyond necessity, except Cora, who appeared at intervals throughout the day with new items of interest or questions that she'd apparently been saving. The real confrontation came in the second week. and it began as real confrontations often do, with something that seemed entirely unrelated to the thing it was actually about. The pantry lock. She went to check the supply room off the kitchen one afternoon, and found the door secured with a padlock she hadn't seen before. She looked at it for a moment, then went to find Nesta, who was at the kitchen table, doing something with a piece of mending and the specific focused economy of a girl who wastes nothing. The supply room is locked, Lorelei said. Nesta looked up. It's always locked. Who has the key, Papa? I need to take an inventory of what's in there. I've been managing the household accounts and I need the full picture. Something moved behind Nesta's carefully managed expression. Papa manages the accounts. He's asked me to manage the household. That's not the same thing. Lorelei kept her voice even. She understood the position Nesta had been in, the oldest child, the one who had kept the machine running. She was not going to fight her about it. I've done an inventory of what I can access. I'd like to sit down with you and go over it. You know this house better than anyone. Nesta looked at her for a long moment with those dark, watchful eyes. You could have been difficult, Nesta said finally. It wasn't a compliment or a concession, just an observation. So could you? Lorelei said. A pause. Then Nesta set down her mending and said, All right. They sat at the kitchen table with Lorelei's notebook, and Nesta went through it with her, correcting the estimates she'd got wrong, confirming the ones she'd got right. The girl was precise and thorough, and Lorelei could see her recalibrating in real time, reassessing the woman across from her who had come in with a notebook and had the figures mostly correct. You're short on flour for winter, Lorelei said. I know. By how much? 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if we're careful. What was the plan? Nesta's jaw worked. Papa was going to sell 2 head before the freeze. Fill the gap. Has he? The pause was long enough to answer. No. Lorelei closed the notebook. I'm going to speak to him. Nesta's head came up. I wouldn't? I know you wouldn't. Lorelei looked at her steadily, but I'm not going to be quiet about things that matter. She found Douglas on the north fence line in the flat gray afternoon, resetting a post with a maul, the kind of rhythmic physical work a man does when he needs to be striking something. She walked up beside him and waited until he paused, breathing hard. We're short on provisions for winter, she said. He looked at her. I know. Nesta says you were planning to sell 2 head. His expression shifted toward something colder and more controlled than anger. Nesta talks. Nesta has been running this household since she was 10 years old. Lorelei kept her voice even. She's talked to me because I asked her directly, and she could see someone finally needed to hear the answer. A pause. When are you planning to sell? When I decide to. You have 5 weeks before hard freeze and 3 girls who need more food than what's in that pantry. She did not raise her voice. It cost her something to keep it level. Cora is 6 years old and she's too thin. I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because it's true. He turned away from her and struck the post once, twice. The sound carried flat and far across the open land. She stayed. After the 3rd strike, he stopped. His shoulders moved with the effort. He didn't turn around. 2 head, he said, to the post rather than to her. I'll arrange it Thursday. She let the silence sit. Thank you, she said. She walked back toward the house. Behind her, after a moment, she heard the maul fall once more. One single different blow. Not the blow of a man hitting something because he can't stop, but the blow of a man completing a task. There is a difference between those 2 things, and in her experience, the difference is where everything important lies. The kitchen became hers, the same way territory is claimed in any household, not by announcement, but through presence and work and the slow accumulation of evidence that the territory is being managed better than it was. She was up at 5 every morning. She cooked proper breakfasts. She began working on the kitchen garden in the evenings, which had not been tended since, she guessed, before Marion Scoffield died, and most of what remained was straggly and past useful, but there were things worth rescuing. 2 rows of late turnips, some parsnips that had survived through stubbornness, a patch of thyme gone ragged that she cut back to something usable. She found a tin box on the 2nd shelf of the kitchen cabinet, behind a cast-iron pot that hadn't been moved in some time. It held recipe cards in a woman's handwriting, some stained with cooking, all of them handled enough to show they'd been used. She knew immediately whose they were. She sat with them one evening for a long time, reading in the lamplight. She made the Bannock recipe the next morning. Card 3, between a soup broth and instructions for canning. When the girls came in for breakfast, Cora stopped in the doorway and went very still. That's the kind Mama made, she said. Lorelei set the pan on the table. Sit down and eat it while it's hot. Cora sat. She ate 2 pieces. She didn't cry because she was 6 and working very hard not to, and Lorelei could see the effort in the set of her chin. But afterward, Cora came to where Lorelei stood at the stove and pressed her forehead against Lorelei's arm, and stayed there for a moment without saying anything. Lorelei kept her eyes on the pot. She put one hand briefly on the back of Cora's head. That was all. Douglas was in the doorway. She didn't acknowledge it, and he didn't say anything. And after a moment, she heard him pour his coffee and sit down at the table. The town's opinion of her arrived at the general store on a Saturday. She'd gone in for thread and found two women from neighboring properties already there, who paused their conversation with the particular pause of people who have just been discussing the person who has just walked in. Harriet Goss, behind the counter, watched with the expression of someone following a situation she could have predicted. The two women were introduced as B. Tollefson and a younger woman named Greer, who had married into the Cartwright property the previous spring. Bea was the kind of woman whose warmth was genuine, but whose curiosity ran slightly ahead of her tact. Greer was watchful, measuring, with the careful social economy of someone who has not yet established her footing in a new place and is not going to spend it recklessly. "We've been wondering about you," Bea said. "Scoffield's not an easy man. He wasn't easy before Marion passed and after." She shook her head with the particular delicacy of a woman conveying a great deal without quite saying it. "Most people aren't easy given enough hardship," Lorelei said pleasantly. "How are you finding it?" Greer asked. More carefully than Bea, more genuinely curious. "The land is good," Lorelei said, and she meant it. She had been surprised by that, by the feeling that had accumulated over 2 weeks of looking out at the Peace River country in the thin autumn light. Something about the scale of it, the way the sky went all the way to the edges. "The house needs work, but the bones are sound. And the girls? 3 girls," Bea said, with the tone of someone who has considered this situation and found it significant. "3 very capable girls," Lorelei said, with a firmness that closed the subject. Greer's eyes sharpened slightly. She was not used to being closed off. "I heard Douglas and Nesta have been at odds," she said. "About the direction of things. Families have disagreements." Lorelei picked up the thread she'd come for and set it on the counter. "That's not news." At the door she paused and looked back at both of them. "The Scoffield family is managing," she said. "They're working at it. That's all any of us can say." She left before anyone could answer. Out on the road with the cold wind, finding the gap at her collar, she felt the town watching from its windows with that particular waiting quality, as though they had bought a ticket to something they expected to fail and were reluctant to leave before it did. She had been watched this way before. In Guelph, after Owen died, the city had watched her with the same patient audience. She lifted her chin and walked back to the wagon. The real rupture came on a Tuesday evening in November, and it started, as things in that house often started, with something that seemed to be about one thing and was actually about another entirely. Bridget had broken a tool. A specific one, a hand auger that Douglas had been careful with for years because replacing it cost money they didn't have, and Bridget had been using it for something she hadn't asked permission for, and the bit had snapped. By the time Douglas found it in the evening, it was past repair. Dinner that night had the specific atmospheric weight of a room where everyone knows something has gone wrong and nobody is saying so. Lorelei kept the conversation moving in the small ways she'd learned worked, asking Cora about the crow she'd seen that afternoon, asking Nesta a question about the flour she'd been saving. She was aware of Douglas at the head of the table saying nothing, eating with a controlled mechanical patience that she recognized as the outside of something considerably less controlled. It was Nesta who finally said something. And what she said was not about the auger. "If we'd bought the replacement last spring when I said we should, this wouldn't be a problem." The table went quiet in the particular way that means something has just changed. Douglas set his fork down. "I remember the conversation," he said. His voice was too level. "I'm just saying, I know what you're saying, then you know I was right." She said it flatly, not cruelly, but the word right, spoken plainly at the dinner table in front of everyone, was the one thing that couldn't be absorbed quietly. "You think you can run this ranch better than I can?" The words came out with a control that was its own kind of anger. Nesta met her father's eyes. She was 12 and had been running on obligation for 2 years, and some part of her had apparently decided tonight that obligation had reached its limit. "I think some decisions have been made around here that I'd have made differently." "Then say which ones, Douglas," Lorelei said, not loudly, directly. "I'd like to hear it," he said. And he wasn't backing down, and neither was Nesta, and they were looking at each other with the specific dangerous attention of two people who have been circling an argument long enough that it has acquired gravity of its own. "The Halverson offer," Nesta said. "Last year, they wanted to lease the North Pasture and you turned it down. That land is, you turned it down because admitting we needed the income felt like losing." Her voice cracked slightly, not from tears, from pressure, from something long held. "We needed it, Papa. We needed it then. Bridget doesn't have proper winter boots. Cora had a cough in September that went on for 3 weeks, and we didn't call the doctor because..." She stopped herself. "Because what?" Lorelei made a decision in approximately 2 seconds. Because they've both been finding ways to fill the gap, she said, into the silence. Evenly, without accusation. Just naming a fact. Nesta and Bridget both. Nesta's been selling eggs to Harriet Goss without putting it through the household accounts. Bridget has been taking in mending from the Cartwright place for 2 months. The silence that followed was a different kind. The kind with weight. Douglas looked from Nesta to Bridget, who was very still with her eyes on her plate and her jaw set. Then back to Nesta. Is that true? It wasn't a question. Yes, Nesta said. Douglas pushed back from the table and stood and walked out of the kitchen. Not slamming the door. The opposite of that, which was somehow worse. The careful, deliberate closing of a man who doesn't trust what he'd do if he let it go. The girls sat at the table. Nobody moved. Then Cora, very quietly, said to no one in particular, "Is Papa coming back?" "Yes," Lorelei said. "He's coming back. Eat your supper." She gave it 40 minutes. Then she put on her coat and went outside. Douglas was in the barn, not working, sitting on a hay bale with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, looking at the ground. The lantern threw long shadows around him. Outside, the wind pressed steadily against the timber walls. She sat down on the hay bale 3 feet away and said nothing for a moment. "You knew," he said finally. "Not an accusation, a fact. About Nesta and Bridget?" "Yes, I found out about 10 days in, and you didn't tell me." "Not immediately." "No," she paused. "I wanted to understand it first. I wanted to figure out if you'd be able to hear it properly." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "And did I?" "Not yet," she said honestly. "But you walked away instead of saying something you couldn't take back. That's worth something." He was quiet again. Up close, he had the look of a man who has just had a door open to a room he's been keeping shut for a long time and hasn't yet decided whether the opening was a disaster or a relief. He suspected it might be both. "My father built this operation," he said finally. "Started with nothing. Worked it for 30 years. He paused. "I swore I would not be the one who let it go." She waited. "When Marion died," he stopped. The name came out differently than everything else he said, older and rougher at the edges. "There were months I don't remember clearly. Just the work. Just getting through it. The girls needed someone upright and functioning. So I was upright and functioning and everything else." He shook his head. "Everything else slid, and you couldn't ask for help. Scoffields don't." He almost smiled without humor. "My father used to say that, like it was something to be proud of." A pause. "And now I find out my daughters have been earning money in secret to keep the household from running short because they knew I wouldn't." He stopped. Something moved through his face, a crack in the containment. The look of a man who has seen himself clearly from the outside and does not particularly like the view. "Nesta is 12 years old." "She is," Lorelei said. "She shouldn't be." His voice went quiet. "She shouldn't be carrying what she's been carrying." "No," Lorelei said. "She shouldn't." A long silence. "And Bridget never says anything," he said. "She just does. She's 9 years old and she just does things because they need doing and she never." He stopped again. "And Cora," Lorelei said, "is 6. And she still talks about Marion more than any of you because she hasn't learned yet that she's not supposed to." The silence after that was different, denser. "I'm not saying this to wound you," she said, and she meant it completely. "I'm saying it because I think you already know. I think you've known for a while and working around it felt more manageable than going through it." He sat with that for a long time. Long enough that one of the horses shifted in her stall. Long enough that the wind outside changed pitch. "I don't know how to fix it," he said finally. The words came out stripped of management. "You don't have to fix it tonight," she said. "You just have to go back in there and say something true to your daughters, that's all." He looked at her. "What if I've gotten so used to saying nothing that I don't know where the true things are anymore?" "Start with what you know for certain." She stood up. "You love them, that's certain. Start there." She left him in the barn. When she reached the door, she heard him get up off the hay bale with the deliberate movement of a man who has decided to do something difficult, and then his footsteps heading toward her. She went to the porch instead of the kitchen. She stood in the cold and watched through the window. Douglas came through the kitchen door, the girls at the table, and then the particular stillness of a room where something is being said that has never been said before. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She could tell by the way Nesta's shoulders dropped. That fraction of an inch, the unmistakable release of someone setting down something heavy, that something real was happening in there. She could tell by the way Bridget looked up and kept looking up, instead of cutting her eyes back down the way she usually did when anything emotional entered a room. She could tell by the way Cora climbed off her chair and went to her father, and pressed herself against his side with the complete and unself-conscious certainty of a child who has just been given back something she thought she'd lost. Lorelei went inside after a while. Nobody acknowledged that she'd given them privacy. The temperature in the room had changed, not dramatically. The way air changes when a window you didn't know was stuck finally opens a crack and you realize the room had been closer than you thought. Douglas looked at her across the kitchen when she came in. Just looked. She gave him a small nod and went to the stove. Nothing was resolved. Old wounds don't close in one evening. They have to be cleaned first, and cleaning hurts, and it happens slowly and leaves marks regardless. She knew that. She thought he was beginning to know it too. But Nesta, doing the dishes at the basin, was moving differently. Not lighter. She'd been carrying too long for light to come quickly. But differently. And Bridget was still at the table, working on something with a piece of thread and a button, staying when she would usually have disappeared the moment supper ended. Lorelei poured her coffee and sat down and let the evening find its own level. December arrived and the snow came seriously, the real kind, and the days shortened to almost nothing, and the work tripled. The barn needed extra attention, the cattle needed watching. The mornings began earlier and ended the same. Lorelei put herself into the rotation without asking. The first morning she appeared in the barn at 5:30 with her coat and her gloves. Nesta looked at her with visible surprise, and then after a moment moved aside to make room on the bench without comment. She learned the ranch through her body that December, through the specific cold of hauling water before the sun came up, through the way a barn smells in winter, that particular combination of animals and hay and timber holding against the cold outside. Through the rhythm of chores that the Scoffield family had been running so long they'd stopped needing to communicate the parts, and through finding where she fit into that rhythm. What she was learning alongside the physical work was something more complicated, the architecture of what had broken in this family and what was still intact. Because something was intact. Under the damage, under the years of grief operating without outlet, there was something stubborn and real. The girls loved each other in the specific way of people who have needed each other and know it. She could see it most clearly when they didn't know she was watching. Nesta spending 40 minutes helping Bridget with her reading after supper, without being asked and without making anything of it. Bridget leaving the bigger portion of the bannock for Cora, so smoothly and consistently that Cora had probably never noticed. Cora drawing pictures and leaving them outside each of her sister's doors in the mornings, never mentioning it, as though small gifts left in secret were simply the correct way to love someone. And Douglas, who was not easy and who was not going to become easy, but who had since the Tuesday evening in the barn begun the almost invisible process of reorientation. She saw it in small things. The way he would pause after supper now, before disappearing, and ask Cora a direct question about her day. The way he watched Nesta sometimes with an expression that was trying to say something his vocabulary didn't quite have words for. The way he had begun, cautiously, to say her name. Not Miss Marsh, not the careful nothing he'd used in the first weeks. Lorelei. With the new and slightly tentative quality of someone allowing himself something he hadn't been sure was permitted. It was not a transformation. She was careful about that. People don't transform. They shift slowly in the direction of persistent pressure and time, and what she was watching was the early motion of a shift, and she did not romanticize it. One evening in the second week of December, after the girls were in bed, she was at the kitchen table with her account notebook when Douglas came in from the cold, stamped his boots, and instead of going upstairs, sat down across from her. She looked up. "There's a family named Halverson 6 miles west," he said without preamble. "I turned down their lease offer last year." A pause. "I've been thinking about writing out, seeing if it's still on the table." She held his gaze. "That's a good idea. I haven't." He stopped. Chose differently. "Things got narrow after Marion, and I let some of the neighbor relationships go. It felt like too much, people coming and asking." He looked at his hands. "It felt like being watched." "They were watching," she said. "People do that. It doesn't mean they want you to fail." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through something, measuring a wall he'd built for reasons that had made sense at the time against what it had cost him. "Take Nesta with you," she said. He looked up. "She should be riding with you when you negotiate with neighbors. She's going to run this place someday, and she needs to know who these people are." She paused. "She also needs to see you doing something other than managing alone." A long moment then. "I'll ask her." She watched him go upstairs. She heard him stop at Nesta's door, the murmur of voices, and then Nesta's door opening wider, both voices working through the logistics of a ride. She could tell by the way the sound changed that Nesta was asking questions and Douglas was answering them, and that this was the first time she'd heard them talk like that. Two people in the same conversation rather than two people exchanging necessary information across a distance they both maintained. She closed her notebook and put out the lamp and went to bed. Through the thin wall she could still faintly hear them talking. It was the first time she'd heard Douglas stay up past 9 o'clock. Spring did not arrive grandly. It came the way things come in northern Alberta, tentatively, and then with sudden commitment. A few days of melt and mud, a cold snap that made everyone think they'd been mistaken, and then warmth that was genuine and stayed. One morning in late March, the frost was gone, and the ground was soft, and there were things growing at the edge of the kitchen garden that had not been asked to grow but had decided to anyway. Lorelei stood in the garden with her work boots on and assessed what winter had left behind. She was planning the season's planting with the same methodical attention she'd brought to the pantry inventory in her first week, and she could feel the difference between those two moments as something almost physical. The woman who had sat at that table in October counting what was there and finding it insufficient was the same woman, carrying the same essential self, but standing in different ground. She had not fixed the Scoffield family. She wanted to be precise about that, because the temptation to make a neater story was real, and she distrusted neat stories. She had not arrived and healed anyone. People don't heal each other that way. They create conditions in which healing becomes possible, and then the healing happens, or it doesn't, in its own time and its own shape. What she had done was stay. That was the core of it. She had stayed when staying was difficult, and spoken when speaking carried risk, and worked without being asked, and pushed against things that needed pushing, and given room to things that needed room. She had guessed wrong sometimes. She could name those moments. She had misjudged Douglas twice in ways that had cost them time. She had pushed Bridget too directly once, and the girl had gone silent for 4 days, and she'd had to figure out without instruction how to approach a 9-year-old who processes everything quietly and resists every kind of approach that draws attention to the processing. She had been a person navigating a difficult situation with the instruments available to a person, which are always incomplete. And somehow, out of all that imperfect navigation, something had been built that hadn't been there in October. She was still thinking about this when she heard Douglas on the porch. She came around to the front of the house and found him standing at the railing, looking out at the thawing land with a cup of coffee in his hand, and the expression of a man who has come outside to think about something and is still thinking about it. He heard her and turned. "The Halverson lease came through," he said. "I heard from Nesta." He nodded. He looked back at the land. "My father would have called that weakness," he said. "Leasing to a neighbor because you can't run the full acreage alone." "Was your father happy?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that the question had time to settle properly. "No," he said finally. "I don't think he was." She didn't draw the line out loud from his father to him. She trusted him to draw it himself, which he was clearly in the process of doing. "The ranch is in better shape than it was in October," he said. "It is, that's not only the lease." He looked at her directly. He had, over the winter, become someone she was beginning to know in the slow way you come to know difficult things, without the benefit of simplicity, but with the benefit of depth. He was still not easy. He was still more silence than speech. He still sometimes withdrew to somewhere she couldn't follow, and she had stopped trying to follow and started waiting instead, and he almost always came back. "I wrote that advertisement," he said. 9 words, no period at the end. "I wrote it the way I write everything. As short as possible, because longer felt like asking for something, and I'd gotten very good at not asking for things." He paused. "I told myself I needed a capable woman to help manage the household. That was true. But I also told myself that was all I needed, and that was..." He stopped. "Not true," she offered. "A simplification," he said, in the tone of a man being precise. "I have in fact developed a different understanding of what I need, over the course of this winter." He looked at her with the most undefended expression she'd seen on him. Not open exactly. More like a door with the lock turned but not yet pushed. "I told myself in that advertisement I wasn't looking for more than a partnership. I am aware that I was partly telling myself that to avoid the alternative, which was wanting something I wasn't certain I could ask for." He set his coffee cup on the railing. "I would like this to be a real marriage, Lorelei, not what I advertised, if that's something you're willing to consider." The land stretched out before them, greening at the edges where the thaw was doing its work. The sky was enormous and pale and full of light. She thought about Guelph and the rented room and the gray wall she'd stared at, and the decision she'd made with someone else's newspaper in her lap. She had not come here for this. She had not let herself want this. Wanting things that weren't certain had seemed like something she couldn't afford. She looked at Douglas Scoffield, this difficult and private and slowly opening man, and thought, "He is not easy. He will not become easy. I knew that in November, and I am still here." "Yes," she said. "That's something I'm willing to consider." Something crossed his face. Relief, she thought, and under it something older and quieter, the look of someone who has been braced against a thing for a long time, and has just been told he can put it down. "Good," he said. Then Cora came around the side of the house at a run with something cupped in both hands. A frog, as it turned out, the first of the season, which she presented for inspection with enormous seriousness. And the moment broke into the ordinary particular chaos of a child who has found something extraordinary and requires an immediate audience. Douglas crouched down to look at it. Cora narrated its qualities in detail. Lorelei stood on the porch watching the two of them, in the thin spring morning. This man she was beginning to know, and this child who had tied her boot on the first day, and pressed her forehead against her arm in the kitchen, and felt the thing she had stopped being afraid to call by its name settle into her chest like something that had been looking for somewhere to land. She was home, not because it was easy, not because the hard parts were finished, because they weren't, and they wouldn't be, but because she had learned somewhere between October and March that home is not a thing you arrive at. It's a thing you build in the spaces between people, in the room opened by telling the truth, and staying when staying costs something, and choosing, again and again, the people in front of you over the easier thing. She had chosen, and they had chosen her back. The frog escaped, as frogs do, and Cora shrieked, and Douglas made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, short and rusty from disuse, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time, but real. And Lorelei went down the porch steps to help look for it, because that was where her family was, in the mud and the spring light, and that was where she intended to be.